The Female Eunuch is a 1970 polemical work by the Australian author Germaine Greer. Greer was born in Melbourne in 1939. She had a difficult childhood with an abusive mother, and she left home when she was 18. She studied French and English at Melbourne University and joined a group of anarchists called the Push in Sydney. In 1964, she emigrated to study at Cambridge, where she completed a PhD. 4 years later, she became an assistant lecturer at Warwick. The Female Eunuch was her first book. It's essentially a piece of social criticism supported by a wealth of empirical evidence. Since that evidence is taken largely from the British society of the 1960s, it has dated a little. However, its main contentions remain highly relevant. In late 2024, the London Metro newspaper launched a campaign to tackle violence against women. We know that in the UK, over 100 women each year are killed at the hands of men, it told us, and that around the world, every 11 minutes, a woman or girl is killed in her own home. What's even more shocking is that the problem's getting worse. Greer's book is divided into 4 parts, the fourth of which, entitled simply Hate, outlines the breadth and intensity of the misogyny. The book's title comes from her claim that today's female all too often resembles a castrated male, taught from infancy not to explore her own sexuality. The censorship eventually extends to all her experience, so that when she becomes aware of her sex, the pattern has sufficient force of inertia to prevail over new forms of desire and curiosity. It links, Greer thinks, to Freud's claim that the libido is invariably and necessarily masculine in nature. In her introduction to the 21st anniversary edition, she wrote, "Wherever you see nail varnish, lipstick, brassieres and high heels, the eunuch has set up her camp. You can find her triumphant even under the veil. As for the solution, it is unknown, just as the sex of the uncastrated female is unknown. However far we can see, it's not far enough to discern the contours of what's ultimately desirable. The first exercise of a free woman is to devise her own mode of revolt." At the book's heart is a critique of the nuclear family. The working girl who marries, Greer says, works for a period after her marriage and retires to breed, is hardly equipped for the isolation of the nuclear household. Her horizon shrinks to the house, the shopping centre and the telly. Her child is too much cared for, and when her husband returns from work, soon banished from the adult world to his bed, so daddy can relax. The Oedipal situation, which was always duplicated in marriage, is now intensified to a degree that Freud would have found appalling. Daddy really is a rival and a stranger. Greer favours the STEM family over the nuclear family. She writes persuasively of the superiority of feudal arrangements and bolsters her position with autobiographical observations from her stay with an extended family in southern Italy, where, in spite of the grimmest poverty, the children were the happiest, least coy and irritable of any that I've ever observed. She doesn't idealise either setup, but thinks it's much better than what we currently have. She doesn't think there's any real scientific evidence that men and women are intrinsically very different, and she spends a lot of the early part of the book demolishing the related bad science. She also uses child psychological research to argue that children are generally brought up to be far too dependent on their parents, and that they benefit from a more hands-off approach generally. Ultimately, she believes that men and women are victims of the same setup. Men are the enemy, she writes, in much the same way that some crazed boy in uniform was the enemy of another like him, in most respects except the uniform. One possible tactic is to get the uniform off. She doesn't pull any punches with her own sex. Women are often genuine and unpleasant, and even warped, but for the same reason, men are radically misshapen. Our concern throughout is for ordinary women. She's critical of many second-wave feminists, partly because for some of them, radicalisation is an academic process, but also because of their excessive theorising. It's not true that to have a revolution, you need a revolutionary theory, she insists. She writes intelligently, addressing the reader colloquially and bluntly in a way that was fairly new in a serious work. If you think you're emancipated, she says early on, you might consider the idea of tasting your own menstrual blood. If it makes you sick, you've got a long way to go, baby. The Female Eunuch became one of the best-selling feminist books of all time. Not all feminists were or are fans, but it's long since earned its place in history. And if that makes it sound like a museum piece, it isn't. It's still an urgent read for both sexes. And more than that, in many ways, it's still ahead of its time.